All right, thanks everyone. I'm the one standing up here today, but there's a lot of people in this room that have contributed to this work. So I just want to acknowledge that as we lead into this. So I'm going to talk about WISDM, the Workbench for Integrated Species Distribution Modeling, which is a new package available within SyncroSim. And the first thing I want to provide is a little context for what I'm talking about. When we say species distribution model, there's a lot of different model types that this encompasses. But at least for right now, what we're building within WISDM are these correlative species distribution models that are built using point locations for where a species occurs on the landscape that can be related to environmental characteristics at those locations, with those covariates being things that you think might be important in controlling where a species might or might not be found. And these can be fed into a mathematical algorithm that produces relationships that can then be used to produce a map of where something might occur on the landscape. So there's lots of different ways out there to create species distribution models. I have a couple screenshots of some online versions, like our Shiny app. There's the Maxent standalone software as well. But there's more than 60 packages associated with at least one of 4 model stages. So there's a lot out there for someone to try to sort through. A graphical user interface can often be lacking. So for those that have talked here about their RPTSD, having that kind of interface is useful. And I think it's been shown through various talks at the conference here, there's alternative outputs from these types of models can feed into STSIM models. And so having a better connection there could be useful. And the screenshot that I am showing here is the VisTrail software for assisted habitat modeling, or SOM, which was SOM was a set of modules that we developed here at USGS that was within this VisTrails modeling framework that's maybe analogous to SyncroSim, except it hasn't been updated, and probably nobody in this room, unless you've used SOM, has ever heard of VisTrails. And so our research group still heavily uses the software, and we've been thinking about, what can we do to move forward with it? And so that's kind of where this idea for SyncroSim WISDM was born. And we started development in 2021. And what we've been doing so far is taking that same kind of framework that we developed within SOM and updating those modules and wrapping them within SyncroSim. And so I have some screenshots here from the package that probably looks familiar to all of you, just in that it's the same kind of framework as other packages within SyncroSim. And so there's a beta version of WISDM available right now, and it encompasses different steps in the modeling process, including data preparation, which can be a pretty big task, getting all your data lined up, functions to help with variable reduction, different model algorithms, producing outputs, and then visualizing those outputs as well. And so I have an image here showing the pipeline within WISDM, where you can prepare the multiprocessing to make things be faster. There's spatial data preparation, non-spatial data preparation, variable reduction. You can add different algorithms. There's a different line for each one of those. And then applying the model, which is how you'd get spatial outputs. And so I'm just going to walk through these different stages and different inputs to what you can feed into WISDM right now. So related to data preparation, there's a template raster which you can provide, and this is a raster that defines your study extent and the spatial resolution of your species distribution model. You provide covariate data in the form of rasters that cover your study area, field data that's just XY coordinates for where an organism occurs or doesn't occur, and often with species distribution models, you only have occurrence data, you have where something's absent. So there's also functions to help generate background data that can be used to help fit these models. There's validation options, including cross-validation and test train splits, and then setting up your spatial multiprocessing. So for variable reduction, you have a set of covariates that you've provided, but you may not actually want to use those all in the development of the model. So we have site data that relates the field data that you have to the values for those covariates at those locations. And then there's a covariate correlation viewer, which is shown here. And this is just an image to try to help you decide what covariates you may want to include versus drop. If there's a high correlation between a couple of variables, you probably want to drop them. So we have along the diagonal a histogram of values for your field data. Above that diagonal is the correlation coefficient between those different covariates, and below the diagonal is the scatter plot of that. So on the far left, you can select or unselect what covariates you actually want to use within the model. And then the outputs will produce your reduced covariate lists that are what is actually fed into the model algorithm. So in the beta version we have right now, there's 3 different model algorithms. Generalized linear models, random forest, and maxent are available. And we have plans within the next year to add some additional models. And the suite that we have decided to include are ones in a recent paper looking at performance of a lot of different model algorithms. They're the ones that were the top performing from within that publication. And then for each of the algorithms within WISDM, there's different parameters specific to that algorithm that you can specify parameter values for and change those. There's also different output options, so you can decide what maps you may want to produce, and these include a probability map, a most dissimilar variable or mod map that spatially shows which one of your covariates was the most important at that particular location. So that can provide useful information. There's the multivariate environmental similarity surface. And what that is showing is how close the covariates at a pixel are to the values within your training data. So it can give you an idea of where you're really extrapolating on the landscape, but you might have less confidence in your model. And then a map of residuals from your model that can just be a way of looking at your results. And if you see a spatial pattern, realize that maybe there's something that you're missing that you want to go back and add to your model. There's also the ability to visualize your outputs within SyncroSim. And so one, I guess, new feature that we had requested was being able to include PNGs in the visualization within SyncroSim itself. And so there's different outputs produced from each model, including response curves for your covariates, a map of residuals, a calibration plot, confusion matrix, validation metrics, and then figures showing variable importance for each one of the model algorithms. And then you can also view the maps that I showed on the previous slide. So I wanted to walk through an example showing the interaction between outputs from WISDM and STSIM. And so we took this example that we simplified from a paper by Brian Miller and others for Badlands National Park that simulated resources and management actions. And the 4 things that state transition simulation model focused on was grassland vegetation, grazing, invasive species spread and treatment, and climate change. And so for the invasive species spread and treatment, where that species could establish on the landscape was determined by the outputs from a habitat suitability model. And so for that, the main species of concern within Badlands National Park was Canada thistle. So within WISDM, we fit a model for Canada thistle to current environmental conditions. But as I mentioned on the previous slide, one of the things that they were concerned with in the park was climate change and how it would affect those other things. And so we fit the model to current environment, created those maps, and then we ran spatial data preparation on the future covariates, and then using a dependency on the model that we'd already fit with the apply model in the pipeline, we could apply that Canada thistle model to the future climate conditions, and then those outputs could then be fed into SyncroSim. And so we had Canada thistle establishment as a transition spatial multiplier with the one-way linkage from WISDM to STSIM, where that multiplier was updated during the simulation timeframe. And so here's an output from that. And what I'm showing here, we ran 4 different scenarios. One set is labeled as constant, which indicates that it just used current climate throughout the entire simulation run. The second is an update, which included climate change. And so the underlying establishment probability based on that habitat suitability map was updated during the run. And then we had another set of things that we varied, which was whether or not herbicide spraying happened. And so the first 2 columns have herbicide spraying happening, the second to show that it was untreated. And hopefully you can see it from where you are, but the purple color is where there's thistle on the landscape. And so if you compare the constant versus the updated, you can see that there's a lot more thistle on the landscape there, as well as over here. And the same thing is shown in the graph that's showing the amount of invaded area over time with those same sets of scenarios, again, with the updated scenarios having more thistle at the end of those runs. And so this is just a very simplistic example showing that, updating the underlying habitat suitability model within STSIM really had an effect on the amount of thistle that there was during the simulations. And so this was one example of a one-way interaction where the outputs of WISDM fed into STSIM and updated one of the items happening throughout this simulation. You can think of other examples where maybe a one-way link going the other direction could be important. So if you think of a threatened and endangered species where land use land cover might be really important for it, and that's changing over time, that you could have the outputs at different time steps of STSIM feed into a model or how you're applying the WISDM model, and you could see how the habitat suitability might change over time with the underlying changes in land use conditions. We've also talked about two-way interactions where you could have feedbacks between fire or management actions that modify underlying habitat suitability, and then you could also have climate change in there affecting the habitat suitability that might feed back into STSIM. And one thing to think about that we haven't investigated too much is how frequently should these updates happen. So within the Canada thistle in the Badlands example I showed, that was just a single update, which resulted in a bit of a change right when you switched, but updating at every time step would result in a big computational cost to that dynamic linkage. So those are things to be determined. But thanks for listening about WISDM, and it's available as a beta release. And happy to take any questions.